Welcome back to my channel. This is going to be part 2 of my Gundam for Beginners series. And I also want to quickly apologize for the quality of the pictures in the first part of this series. They were, unfortunately, I didn't notice that they were lower quality until after I'd uploaded the video, because at the time they looked fine on my smaller, like, laptop screen, and I just didn't realize that they were so low quality until after I uploaded it and watched it on my TV. So sorry about that. I know I got much higher quality pictures in this one. Some might not be as good, but you know, that's kind of what happens. Anyways, I appreciate anyone who finished that episode and moved on to this one. And this is going to be part 2, placements, where I go over where each show goes in the 3 different types of Gundam shows. Last time I went over the 3 different types, so if you don't know what that is, watch part 1 and then come to this one. Alright, moving on. So as we know from the first part of this series, there are 3 different types of Gundam shows. But the real question, of course, is going to be the placements of each show, and that's what this particular video is going to solve. So, let's start. I'm going to focus on the Universal Century first, and then we'll move on from there. Now, it's going to take a while because the Universal Century has, I do believe, probably the most amount of shows that take place within it, and that's why it's going to take a pretty good amount of time. But just keep that in mind that the first part might be pretty lengthy, so bear with me here. So, like I said before in a previous video, we're going to start with the original show. Mobile Suit Gundam from 1979 takes place in, obviously, the Universal Century. It's the first one that started it, and it has the majority of the ground. It created the majority of the groundwork for a lot of the other Universal Century shows to build off of, and why they created their own things and added more to the Universal Century without the original show basically being the foundation. We probably wouldn't have had the Universal Century that we think of today. It's the most popular type of Gundam show, and it was the one that, for the longest time, was really the only type of show there was. Because I mean, why would there be any others when it was so successful? So, the original Gundam definitely started here and was the one that laid the groundwork and created the franchise as a whole and created the first type of Gundam series and first type of show, and it created the first timeline and everything. So without the original Gundam, we wouldn't have anything else. But it goes here in the first type of Gundam series. Zeta Gundam, the sequel to the original, is also placed in the Universal Century type of show because that's where it takes place in the timeline, and it is the sequel to the original, so obviously it has to be in the Universal Century category. It's considered to be one of the best shows in the franchise, including myself. I believe it is. And even though it's got tons of other shows that have come out since then, it is still, in my opinion, the best Gundam show to ever come out. It also started a lot of the Gundam traditions. For example, switching to a bigger and more powerful Gundam halfway through the series. In the first show, they only had the one Gundam suit. They did come up with new suits for him to fight, but the main suit never changed. Zeta changed that, where you started off with the Mark II and then got the Zeta Gundam. Gundam Double Zeta also takes place in the Universal Century. It, as its name would entail, is a sequel to Zeta. This show is kind of basically it's easy to overlook and it's easy to skip, um, because it really all it really does is tie up some loose ends that weren't completely solved in Zeta, and that's really all it does. But it does have a really cool opening theme songs that I really enjoy. One's really funny, but the second one's really good. Like, it's just epic. So it's overall, in my opinion, a really good show. It gets a little bit too much hate, but it's a good show. Then you have Chars Counterattack. Chars Counterattack is the first time a Gundam movie was actually a solitary project and wasn't a part of a series. So the previous films were all compilation movies where they were just like basically abridged versions of the show, but as a movie. But Chars Counterattack was a movie that was basically the end of the story. So they basically wanted to go big and they made the ending a movie production instead of a TV show, so they could have a bigger budget and make it more pretty and stuff. And they did this in 88, I think 89, something like that. So it was basically the 10-year anniversary of Gundam, so they went ahead and basically finished up the most important storyline with Char and Amuro as the 10th anniversary. So it's pretty interesting. It's a movie and it belongs in the Universal Century. The next one is, I believe it's 0080 War in the Pocket, which is also a Universal Century series. It is actually the first OVA of the franchise. It's also the first one that focuses on new characters. It has nothing to do with the original story. So even though Zeta and Double Zeta have a bunch of new characters and they're the main focus, they are also playing off of the same old story from the original. And a lot of the characters from the original are in Zeta and Double Zeta. So their story is continuing, and it ends with Char's counterattack. But here, all the characters are new, and there's no true tie to the original story, other than the fact that, it's a bunch of soldiers in their own combat roles during the original show's storyline. So it takes place during the original show's run, like the last month or so, because I know it takes place in December because it's a Christmas movie or a Christmas series. It's only 6 episodes long, and it has one of the most heart-wrenching and emotional endings of all of the shows. The next one, I do believe the next one was 0083 Stardust Memory. And it, too, is an OVA series and is 12 episodes long. It's also really good, but I don't think it's as good as War in the Pocket is, but that's just me. Actually, no. I think it's the other way around. I think Stardust Memory is better than War in the Pocket, but not when it comes to characters, personally, but the story is better. But anyways, it obviously takes place in Universal Century, because it takes place in Universal Century 83. And, it's a good one to watch, but it's a side story, so it's not necessary to watch. The next one is 8th MS Team. Now, 8th MS Team I know happened later on, but I always group these three together because in my mind, I always separate these from all the other Universal Century stuff because they're, they all take place pretty early on in the storyline and all this. So they all kind of go together in my opinion. But anyways, the 8th MS Team is probably the best one out of all three in my opinion. But it's basically just Gundam meets Vietnam, but it also takes place in the Universal Century. So obviously this is a Type 1 show, just like all the others so far. Now, the next one is going to be Gundam F91. Gundam F91, for a lot of people, is pretty much the start of where Gundam started to kind of fumble pretty heavily. And I kind of have to agree to an extent because they were trying to reach a new generation of Gundam fans to continue the Universal Century. And while I think that's totally legit and is a pretty good reason to try and create a movie or a new show to get a new audience, they were attempting to make a show, but they didn't have enough time to finish the series. It only had 13 episodes. So they took what they had, edited it together, and turned it into a movie. And that movie was Gundam F91. It does take place in the Universal Century, but it takes place like 30 or so years further into the timeline. So even though it takes place in the Universal Century, it's starting to feel different and it doesn't feel familiar, which is a huge problem for the next show. But it is Universal Century. The next show is 1993's Victory Gundam. Victory Gundam is where we have a lot of contention. There's a lot of people that hate it and a decent amount of people that like it. I personally hate it. It's a 50 episode series, but the only episodes that are interesting are the last 7, and that's not good when the last 7 episodes are the only interesting ones. I do have to say I love the fact that this show had a pretty big female cast. Double Zeta also had a big female cast, but here there's a lot more variety of races and stuff. So if you want diversity in your anime, this is actually a pretty good one to watch. Mostly. I just personally don't care for the overall story. It takes place like another 30 years beyond what Gundam F91 did, so it's even further removed from the Universal Century, and at this point, it felt so drastically different from what we expect Gundam Universal Century to be, that they basically were like, look, this is too far gone. Why don't you just create an alternate universe shows and do that and make those different, but make Gundam Universal Century stuff the way it should be. So this was the last televised show. Everything else has either been an OVA, an ONA, or a movie when it comes to Universal Century. So this is the last TV show. But obviously, it's Universal Century. Type 1. The next one is going to be MS Igloo. Now, there are 3 separate ones. I'm just going to do them all together right here. Because they're not really that important. You can easily move past them and not really worry about them. But you have MS Igloo, and then you have then another one called MS Igloo 0079, and then you have MS Igloo 2. They're all a part of their own little series, and basically each one Well, the third one's basically an anthology where there's separate stories that all take place in the Gundam universe. And the other two, Igloo OVAs, take place in the later parts of the war, but you follow a Xeon group, and they always are focusing on experimental stuff. It's okay, but basically, its main purpose was to be basically a complete CGI photorealistic test to see if they can do like hyper realistic CGI. And that's basically all it is it's just a test. Or that's how it feels. It feels like an experiment to see how well they did. They did well enough, apparently, back in the day to make 3 sets of them. But overall, they're a mixed bag. But they do take place in the Universal Century. So the next one is G Savior. It is the only so far live action Gundam movie. G Savior is technically a movie that takes place in the Universal Century, but it takes place in basically a parallel universe with the Gaia Gear manga series, which is only 3 mangas long. It was basically an alternate turn of events at what would happen at the after Zeta Gundam, but they ended up creating Double Zeta instead, and they didn't go with the Gaia Gears approach because it was actually a little bit closer to Evangelion than most people want to believe, actually. But the movie itself takes place technically in that continuation, and it's just it's different, but technically it's Universal Century. So, you can watch it if you want. It's not really worth it. It's kind of a bad movie. Really, really cheap, low budget CGI and terrible acting, but it's one of those, like, it's so bad it's good type of deals, personally. But yeah, G Savior is Type 1. It's Universal Century. The next one is going to be Gundam Neo Experience 0087 Green Diver. I know that's one heck of a name. It's actually a special format movie. I don't think it's ever been released on DVD or anything like that. You probably can't even watch it because I can't find it anywhere to watch legally or otherwise. So I really don't know anything about this particular one. It's the only movie I haven't seen, and that's probably because I never can. But it takes place in the Universal Century. And that's really it. That's pretty much all I know about it, except for the fact that it has to do with, I think it has to do with 2 kids that get stuck in a GM or something like that. That's really all I know. And it's Universal Century, so I just wanted to let you know that. Mobile Suit Gundam Unicorn is the next series to talk about, and it's Universal Century as well. It takes place a little further in the timeline. It's not quite late Universal Century, but it's not the part of the Universal Century most people care about. It takes place basically in between. But Unicorn Gundam has become basically the new mascot of the franchise. So for a long time the original was the mascot, then it became the Freedom, and then it became the Double O, and now it's the Unicorn. So Universal Century Type 1. The next one is going to be Gundam The Origin, which is basically a pre-story, or a prequel to the original. Now, technically, it's based off of the manga, which is called The Origin, that came out in 2000. but the manga is technically a complete like retelling, a complete remake of the story, but the anime only focuses on the basically the Char backstory, and that's where Origins takes place. Which is still cool, but I really wish they would have made Origins an entire remake, but besides the point. Anyways, this series is obviously Type 1. It is Universal Century. Mobile Suit Gundam Thunderbolt is next, also obviously another Universal Century show. Thunderbolt is it's kind of a weird it's a weird placement. I think it's an ONA, an online network and a show, original network animation, but I'm not exactly sure what the actual purpose of it is. I mean, it's cool and I like it, but it's just kind of weird. I'm also not a huge fan of the music. I know a lot of people love the music in the show because it's like it's jazz and it's good jazz and stuff. But I've never been the biggest fan of jazz personally, so the music's kind of grating. But that's just my personal opinion on it. You might like it more than me, but it is it is obviously Universal Century, which is why it's in this part of the video. So moving on. The next one is Gundam Twilight Axe. Now this is a another OVA or ONA. I'm not sure which one. It's definitely a weird one. I'm not exactly sure what the point of it is either. I think it's supposed to be tied into Unicorn, because they're explaining that they go back to look for the Sazabi or in the new Gundam, which apparently both have like precursors to the Unicorn or something like that. But really, I don't know about necessarily if that's true, but it is Universal Century, and that's all you really need to know for this section of the video. Then we have Mobile Suit Gundam Narrative. Now, Narrative is a movie, but it's a movie sequel to Unicorn. It's actually technically based off of a novel, which is based on the Phoenix, which is a sequel to the Unicorn novel. I don't know how accurate it is, of course, but basically all I know is that it's based around that novel. It's good. Personally, I think it's a decent movie. I know a lot of people didn't like it, but I feel like if you understand the entirety of the Universal Century timeline, it'd probably help more to enjoying it. Because the one thing about Universal Century that's kind of hard for some people is that you have to connect everything. And sometimes there's gaps, but for the most part, everything is pretty connected in Universal Century. But that's where it takes place. It's Type 1, obviously. And so far, the last Type 1 Gundam series as the making of this video is Mobile Suit Gundam Hathaway's Flash, also just known as Hathaway. We don't, technically know what it's going to be called. It's based off of the manga called Hathaway's Flash, but the movie, I think, is just called Hathaway. I don't know what they're doing with that title. They should just call it Hathaway's Flash, but whatever. It also obviously takes place in the Universal Century, but it starts to take place in the later part of the Universal Century. And yeah, so obviously that's where, it takes place in Universal Century, so that's where it goes. And real quick for a bonus, just as a, kind of a joke, because I did pass it up on purpose so people would get, like, oh my god, you missed something. Gundam Reconquista NG is technically, it says it's part of the Reguild Century, or Reguild Century, however you say it, but it's not an alternate universe series. It's actually a Universal Century show. So technically, Reconquista NG is Type 1. I know it has a different epoch, and it has its own lore and stuff. But they do talk a lot about the universal century within the show, which means it is a part of that timeline. So, as much as we don't like to admit it, Reconquista NG is Type 1, it's Universal Century. The next section is going to be Section 2, and it's going to be dealing with the AU, which stands for Alternate Universe. These are shows that take place in their own timelines, but they all fall into Category 2 or Type 2, which is Alternate Universe. Let's get into it. So the first alternate universe show we're going to be talking about is going to be the first one that ever came out, which is Mobile Fighter G Gundam. Now, Mobile Fighter G Gundam, just like with the Victory Gundam and F91, its attempt was to try and be different enough to capture an audience of a new generation and hope that they would jump over to the alternate universe stuff afterwards. Now, some did, some didn't. It just kind of depends on if it was successful or not. But, Mobile Fighter G Gundam is a Type 2 show, alternate universe. Its timeline is called the Future Century. The next one is the one that most everybody knows when it comes to this franchise, which is New Mobile Report Gundam Wing. Gundam Wing was the first Gundam show to ever come out here in the States in 2000 when it comes to being aired on TV. It was hugely successful and popular, which has made Gundam Wing one of the biggest and most popular shows out here in the West. Which kind of sucks because it's not really that great of a show. It's about a 5 out of 10. It's a very meh show. But it's got a lot of nostalgia for people over here because it was their first one. So a lot of people have a lot of strong memories with it. I'm kind of indifferent. I don't hate it, but I don't love it. It definitely feels like a very middle of the road series for personally. But its timeline is called After Colony. And its type is Type 2. Real quick, I want to mention that Gundam Wing also has Endless Waltz, which was 3 episodes that were released as OVAs, but then were later combined into a compilation movie. Endless Waltz is, it's just basically a sequel. It takes place a little bit after the movie does. A lot of people swear up and down that it's so good and it's even better than the show, but honestly, it's about the same quality in my opinion. I'm not giving it its own section. I'm just tying it into Gundam Wing because why not? It's the same thing. It's just its sequel. It's okay. You can watch it if you want, but it's not necessary. But it does have some really cool Gundam designs, which is really the only good thing about it. The next Type 2 show is After War Gundam X, which is obviously taking place in its own timeline of After War. Which is very interesting because Gundam X is the only Gundam series to have been canceled. Besides the original. So the original show was the first one to ever be canceled, but it got popular afterwards, and Gundam X was canceled pretty early on, and it didn't even make it past 39 episodes. It was supposed to have 50, which gives it a really weird ending. But it was a failed show. It didn't do well for whatever reason, and I think it was really cool. It was kind of like Gundam meets Fallout because it's a post-apocalyptic, but it also is one of the only shows outside of Universal Century that talks about new types. When you watch the show, you'll understand more about that, but it's the only alternate universe show that has new types as the main focus. The next one is going to be Turn A Gundam. Turn A Gundam is the first show that Tomino did that was a alternate universe show. The last one he did was Victory, and then he came back in 1999 to do Turn A. It's called that because it's supposed to be a play on the term, basically, turn of the century. And this was basically Gundam's turn of the franchise. Basically, it was supposed to be another show to try and get a new generation of Gundam fans. It also didn't win. It failed miserably. When it first came out, Turn A was hated by the community. But over the years, it seems to have gotten way more popular. I don't understand why, because personally, the people who said it was terrible, I actually agree with. I think it's really bad. One of the only shows I truly think is terrible. But you can watch it if you want and make up your own decision. But it's Type 2. It's alternate universe show, and it's also called the Correct Century because they tried to merge all of the different timelines into one with this series, and it does a horrible job. So people would argue that belongs in Universal Century and all this, but to make it easier to understand, I like to just leave it in the alternate universe timeline because it makes it easier for everyone. Make it its own thing, and even though the show tries to connect it to everything else, I don't connect it to everything else because it does a horrible job. So I don't even count it in the Universal Century. It's its own thing. It's alternate universe. Leave it there. Don't try and put it into any other timelines because it makes things too messy. The next one is Mobile Suit Gundam Seed. Now, a lot of people have a lot of opinions about Gundam Seed, and most of the fan base say it's terrible. I completely disagree. I think it's awesome. It has its problems, just like any show does, but it's still a great show. Its main purpose, of course, was to try and get a new generation of Gundam fans, just like every alternate universe show is. But it was also supposed to be the show to basically carry the torch, and it was going to be the main series that Bandai focused on. Unfortunately, this didn't turn out to be the case after the fan base basically rejected it and the writer got sick and eventually died. So with this series, it's alternate universe, but it's basically a remake of the first Gundam show, and its timeline is called Cosmic Era. So basically, they made their own alternate universe so that they could recreate the Universal Century the way they wanted to for a new generation, hoping that would help, but unfortunately it didn't. It also has a sequel called Gundam Seed Destiny that is also hated, and it is a pretty bad show, honestly. It's not great. I wouldn't say it's bad, but it's okay. It's a little better than I would have expected, but it's not amazing. And they also have a movie called Stargazer. It's just kind of there. I don't really think it's bad or good. It's just it's a thing that exists. It's there. Just be aware of it. They're all connected, and they're all alternate universe Type 2 shows. Now, Mobile Suit Gundam Double O is the next show, and Mobile Suit Gundam Double O is definitely a beloved series, and it rightfully so. It is a really good show, but it doesn't take place in its own timeline. It technically takes place in our timeline, the Anno Domini timeline, or AD. And the thing is about that is it takes place so far in the future that, it's like our timeline, but really crazy technology. But it hasn't, but it's not connected to the Universal Century. So Universal Century's got the same kind of plot setup. It takes place really far in the future, but it's supposed to be our own timeline. But obviously, they don't mix. This is an alternate universe show, so it's a Type 2. It has no connection to Universal Century or any other show. It's its own thing. It does have a sequel as with a movie called Awakening of the Trailblazer. It's just there. I honestly don't really think it's that great. Personally, I would have been extremely disappointed if I had to wait 3 years for that movie to come out. But getting into the franchise later allows me to watch all these shows without the wait in between series. So watching it, years later and then realizing it came out 3 years after the show did, but the movie was teased at the end of the second season, I would have been very disappointed walking out of the movie theater. Because while it's an okay movie, it's just kind of slapped together when it comes to story and plot. I think it's not that great. The show is better than the movie, in my opinion. But it's Type 2 because it's a part of Gundam Double O. The next one is Gundam Age. Now, Gundam Age, again, was trying to be a new show for a new generation, but was trying to do two things at one time. It was trying to get a younger generation of kids, so like really young kids, probably around the ages of 8 to like 5 and 4. But they also knew that, of course, the people who are going to watch it are the older people who've been the part of the main franchise. So they tried to appeal to the older audience, but also get kids into it as well. And the problem is that they didn't do either. The young fan base turned away from it because it was too complicated for them, even though it looked like a little kid's show. And adults were turned away because it looked like a little kid's show, even though people who watched it, like myself, usually say it's pretty good, but most people who say it's bad haven't even watched it. And the few who have watched it are only saying it's bad because they don't like the way it looks, but they're not even paying attention to the story, which is actually pretty good. Honestly, it is. But regardless, it's a Type 2 show, and its timeline is called the Advanced Generation. So, the next and final alternate universe or show, or Type 2 show, is Mobile Suit Gundam Iron-Blooded Orphans. Now again, Iron-Blooded Orphans tried to do the same thing. It tried to create a different generation or a new generation of Gundam fans, but it mostly succeeded, actually. This is like one of the few times where it succeeded and brought in quite a few new fans, but they seem to only be fans of IBO, which causes them to have friction with the rest of the community. So a lot of the community has started to turn their backs on them and be like, well, your show sucks, but in reality it doesn't. Iron-Blooded Orphans is a good show. It's a brutal show, and it will probably tug on your heartstrings, especially if you get attached to characters very easily. This show holds no punches. It's a lot more like Zeta Gundam in that respect. But it is Type 2, which means it's an alternate universe show, and its timeline is called Post-Disaster. On to the final section, Section 3, Other. This is going to be the section that has spin-offs, parodies, and other random things in it. So, let's get started. SD Gundam, or the classic SD Gundam, which is also sometimes referred to as the BB Senshi, but technically that's only the model kit line is called BB Senshi. The original shows are just called SD Gundam, and they started off as a parody, but ended up becoming so popular that they ended up getting their own, basically became a part of their own franchise and have like their own different timelines in and of themselves. So it gets pretty crazy. But the old school stuff, which is from the late 80s up to the middle to early 90s, is usually all referred to as just SD Gundam. After this is when they start having other shows with different names, but basically anything from the 80s up to the mid 90s is just referred to as SD Gundam or BB Senshi, if you want to call it that, to differentiate it from the newer SD stuff. The next one would be Gundam Evolve. Now, I know a lot of people probably wouldn't have expected me to actually include Gundam Evolve because it really just doesn't matter at all. Because unlike MS Igloo that tries to tell a story, Gundam Evolve is just a bunch of random short animated clips that were made mostly to do the same kind of thing that Igloo was, which was to basically test their animation skills with 3D space and 3D renders and stuff like that. So it definitely goes in this category because it would fall under other. It's not a spinoff and it's not a parody. So it's just kind of all over the place. It's not really worth watching, but if you want to check it out, you can. It's got 15 episodes, and it's just there. It's kind of a waste of time, but if you want to check it out, you can. Again, like I said, it's just there. It's other. So there you go. Now, the next spin-off one is going to be Superior Defender Gundam Force. This was the attempt in the early 2000s to try and get American children who were younger American kids, probably around the same age as as kids who watch Care Bears, 2 to 5, interested in Gundam. And the show actually did pretty well. It had 2 seasons, but unfortunately, for whatever reason, the second season was never aired here. Only the first one was. And even though the show was always made with an American audience in mind, there were still things that were changed unnecessarily, like changing the intro and outro music to just being stock music that you hear in the background of the show. Kind of lame when the shows had fully produced openings in the Japanese version. But other than that, it's the same thing. The second season does have an English dub, even though it was never released here. Never aired here, because they eventually released it later on DVD with the voice actors reprising their roles. But sadly, that DVD is out of print and is really expensive. So if you're someone who's really into Superior Defender Gundam Force, it's pretty tough to actually find stuff on it or merchandise that's not outrageous. It was actually a really good show, honestly. I watched it. It gets really dark. You wouldn't think a show meant for kids that's like 5 would be that dark. And it gets there. It gets really serious. Even though, for the most part, the show is this over-the-top, silly, goofy, typical show you would expect for something that was targeting kids at that age of that time era. You would think of it kind of like something similar to Roly Poly Oly or something, and it's similar to that at first, but it goes far left field after a while. And it becomes crazy. It's actually really good, honestly. I'm not even going to lie. I didn't think SD would ever make something that I would be interested in, but I have to be honest. Not just this one, but all of SD has really surprised me. It's made me a pretty big fan, honestly. I ain't gonna lie. But it is Type 3 because it's a spinoff. The next one is SD Gundam Shigokuden Brave Battle Warriors. Yeah, I have no idea how hard that was actually to try and say. I had a lot of outtakes. Anyways, um, this is obviously a spin-off series, and it takes place in the SD Gundam universe, but it's based in the timeline with the ancient Chinese stuff. So it's a part of that one. And Mobile Suit Gunpla Builders Beginning G is a 3-part special that came out in 2010 that actually had a pretty good amount of fan love, and people were actually like, man, that's actually a really cool idea. And originally they only made it a special because they really didn't know how people would react to it. And the show is about the idea of people building Gundam model kits like I do, and using them to battle each other. And they take it from the 1984 manga or 89 manga that's been running for a long time. And the whole idea of the manga series was basically the same thing. You build model kits and you fight each other. Kind of like taking the idea of Pokemon or Yu-Gi-Oh, but instead of cards or monsters, it's model kits. And in Beginning G, it was based around a virtual reality. And it's pretty cool. It's really short. It gives you a glimpse of what could have been if they continued it. But it's a spin-off series, and it's pretty good. It's actually worth checking out because of what comes up next. But it's obviously Type 3. Gundam Build Fighters is basically a spiritual successor to Builders Beginning G. Now, while the concept is basically the same, they're not actually connected to each other. Sadly, they don't actually have them connected in the story. Kind of sucks, but unfortunately, they did it that way so they could do whatever they wanted, I guess. Regardless, Gundam Build Fighters is basically the same idea, but instead of it being based in virtual reality, you place them on these holographic tables, and a fictional particle basically allows the plastic to come to life and move, and you can control it, and you battle each other, and basically people have turned it into a competitive sport. That's what it's about. It's a good one. It's Type 3 spinoff. The next Type 3 show is Mobile Suit Gundam Sun. It's just a straight up parody. This show is wild. It's over the top. Honestly, it's really hard to describe it because if you haven't seen the shows that it's making fun of, which is mostly the first one and Origins, it's kind of hard to actually laugh at it because a lot of the jokes won't land. But really, it's hilarious. It really is. It's so over the top and absurd that the entire time I felt like my brain was melting. It's insane. But it's Type 3. It's because it's a parody show. Then we ended up getting Gundam Build Fighters Try, which is a sequel to Build Fighters. It technically focuses on a new set of characters. There's a little bit of reference to the original group and the original show, but really it has very little to do with the original. And also, Build Fighters had OVAs and even a movie attached to it, unlike Build Fighters, which only had 3 specials. So Build Fighters Try was more expansive, and it expanded more on how the
whole system works, but it doesn't expand on things that you wanted it to expand on, like what's up with that other dimension that pops up in the first show, and it is like never mentioned again. And in Build Fighters Try, it never pops up unless you watch the movie, and in the movie, like the other parallel dimension that's in the franchise pops up for a brief moment. They all think she's a ghost, and then it cuts back to the girl, and then you realize that she's actually has to do with characters from the first show. So there is a little bit of a connection there, but there's no explanation. And that's my biggest problem with Build Fighters Try. I absolutely love it. I think it gets too much hate by the uh, Universal Century fan base, but it's really good. And I think Build Fighters Try is awesome. But so far, these shows have been successful because both kids and adults have kind of liked them equally. So it's a good one, and it is. It really is a good one. Gundam Build Divers comes out next, and it is a technically it's a sequel to Build Fighters and Build Fighters Try, but it is pretty different. It's more like Beginning G, where it's virtual reality. And that's basically it. It's just they turn it into a virtual reality, but instead of it being a virtual reality, the way it was in Beginning G, here it's like an MMO. It's actually really cool, um, and it sets up this really neat idea of basically the love that people have for their Gundam kits. Um, Ended up become basically being scanned into the system. And so, even though everything on the kit was correct, it would always scan in an extra bit of information that wasn't attached to the kit, or at least they thought. And this was, of course, the emotion that people put into their kits, the love and the passion, which ended up creating a, a electronic life form. It's pretty wild. I think it's a really cool, neat idea. Build Divers is kind of iffy for some people. Some like it, some don't. But I think it was a good one, and it's a spin-off. It's Type 3. SD Gundam World, Sengoku, Saikokuden is basically a sequel to the other Saikokuden show. And it also focuses on the Chinese or ancient Chinese timeline, but it's based more around the idea of the three kingdoms. Which, if you've ever played Dynasty Warriors, you know what I'm talking about. And it's basically what it feels like. It feels like a Dynasty Warriors Gundam series, but it's really good. It also has to do with zombies. It's wild, but it's also a spinoff. And finally, the last one is Gundam Build Divers Rerise, a sequel to Build Divers, which is, again, pretty much its own thing, but has a slight connection. But it's also really good. And I've only seen the first season. I haven't watched the second, mostly because I want the show to be dubbed in English before I watch it. Not because I can't watch it in sub, but because I watched the first season in dub already. And I hate swapping between the two. So I'm going to wait for it to be dubbed. But it is technically out now. It's been completely released. And I think it's so far it's really good. I've only seen the first season, so I can't tell you how the second season is handled. But the first season was really well done and was just interesting. I was hooked the entire time. Regardless, it's a part three or type three of the franchise, so it's a spinoff. And that is all of the different types of shows, or all the different shows labeled in their correct uh, categories, at least according to me. Some people probably wouldn't agree with some of the orientations of where I put certain shows, but that's because they don't pay attention to the actual structure of how the categories are and set up. But regardless, that's how I believe the shows are set up, and you can use this for your own to help you out with where certain shows go and where you want to start with. Again, I will make another video talking about that, which will probably be the next one, of where a beginner should start. But when it comes to this video, this is done and over with. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe and hit that notification bell if you've made it this far, and leave a comment if you wish. Thank you for finishing the video if you have, and I'll see you next time. Peace.